All right, so today we're doing something really cool. I think a lot of you will find this super fascinating. We are going to go on a deep dive into the world of nonverbal communication.
Yeah, we're basically going to try to help you guys understand what people are really saying, even when they're not using words.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So our source material today comes from a book written by a former FBI agent called What Everybody is Saying, an ex-FBI agent's guide to speed reading people. And it is packed with insights from his years in law enforcement counterintelligence and behavioral analysis.
He doesn't just rely on his own experiences, though. He actually draws a lot from academic research in nonverbal communication, and he was mentored by and worked with some of the top experts in the field.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like early in his career, Townsend and Dean Clive II were huge influences. And then within the FBI, he learned so much from guys like Doug Gregory, Tom Riley, Julian J. Kerner,
hmm
Dr. Richard Alt, David G. Major. I mean, just a powerhouse team right there.
Totally. And then you've got all these incredible academics who've really shaped our understanding of nonverbal communication. People like Joe Kulis, Paul Ekman, who is like the godfather of facial expression research, Maureen O'Sullivan, Frank Belladipallo, who's done groundbreaking work on deception.
Aldert Vrij, too, another
Yeah.
big name in deception research. Reed Malloy, the forensic psychologist. Judy Burgon, who studies communication. David Gibbons from the Nonverbal Communication Institute. Desmond Morris, who wrote all those fascinating books about human behavior. Edward Hall, the pioneer of proxemics, the study of how we use space.
And of course, you can't forget Charles Darwin. His book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, was like the foundation for so much of this research. So this author is really standing on the shoulders of giants here.
Absolutely. And he also acknowledges other important contributors like Elizabeth Lee Barron, Dr. Phil Quinn, Professor Barry Glover, photographer, Mark Wemple, administrative assistant Ashley B. Castle, and artist David R. Andrade. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Our mission today is to give you some really practical tips on how to observe and interpret nonverbal cues in your everyday life. We want you to walk away from this deep dive with a better understanding of what people are really thinking and feeling, and how to spot those subtle signals that might be hidden beneath the surface.
Right, because this isn't some magical ability you're born with. This is a skill anyone can learn and improve with practice, just like working out a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Totally. And the first step is to become more aware of your surroundings,
Yeah.
really paying attention to the people and the environment around you. The author starts the book with this really interesting experiment called the gorilla suit experiment.
I love this experiment. It just shows you how easy it is to miss something if you're not really focused. Tell us about it.
So basically, they had people watching this video of a bunch of individuals passing a basketball back and forth, and they asked them to count the number of passes. Pretty simple, right? Well, during the video, someone wearing a full gorilla suit walks right through the middle of the scene, and you would think everyone would notice that, right?
Yeah, you'd think so.
But amazingly, a huge chunk of the viewers were so focused on counting the passes that they completely missed the gorilla. They were looking right at it, but they didn't actually see it.
It's mind-blowing, isn't it? It really highlights the difference between just seeing something and actively observing it.
Exactly. Observation isn't passive. It's an active process of directing your attention to what's happening around you. So the first takeaway for you guys is to start being more mindful of your surroundings. Try to notice the little details that you might normally miss.
Okay, so we're paying attention now,
Right.
but where do we start when it comes to understanding someone's nonverbal communication?
Great question. You need to establish a baseline for each individual you're interacting with. Think of it like taking someone's vital signs. A doctor needs to know your normal temperature and blood pressure to tell if something's wrong.
Makes sense. So by observing someone's typical behavior when they're relaxed,
Yeah.
you can then spot any deviations from that norm, which could indicate something significant.
Exactly. Those deviations are what you want to pay attention to. They might signal stress, discomfort, or even deception. So even in a brief interaction, try to get a sense of the person's baseline. How do they normally stand? How much do they gesture? What's their usual facial expression? Once you have that baseline, you can start looking for changes.
That's a great tip.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to something the book calls intention cues. These are the subtle nonverbal signals that hint at what someone is about to do. The author tells this amazing story about his dad and an attempted robbery at his hardware store.
Oh man, this story is so powerful. So back in 1974, the author was working in his dad's hardware store in Miami, and he noticed this guy acting super suspicious near the cash register. He wasn't in line, he didn't have any merchandise, he was just kind of loitering, and his eyes were glued to the till.
So he was clearly up to no good.
Yeah, But the real giveaway, the intention cue that alerted the author, was when he saw the guy's nostrils flare just slightly. It's called nasal wing dilation, and it happens unconsciously when your body is preparing for action, taking in more oxygen, fight or flight.
Wow, that's incredible.
Right, so the author, knowing this, instantly yelled out a warning just as the cash store opened and the guy made his move.
Talk about being in the right place at the right time.
Seriously, his dad, who was at the register, was totally caught off guard, but because of that split-second awareness of that tiny nonverbal cue, he was able to react in time and prevent the robbery from happening.
That's such a powerful example of how important observation can be. I mean, it literally saved the day. And it's not just anecdotal evidence that supports the power of nonverbal cues. The legal system itself recognizes the importance of these signals.
Absolutely. The author brings up this landmark U.S. Supreme Court case, Terry v. Ohio from 1968, which basically established the legal precedent for police officers to stop and frisk individuals, even without a warrant, if their behavior suggests they're about to commit a crime.
So the highest court in the land has acknowledged that nonverbal cues can be reliable indicators of criminal intent.
Yep. That case was huge for law enforcement in the U.S., and it really validates the importance of understanding nonverbal communication for assessing someone's intentions.
Okay, so we've talked about observation and intention cues. Now let's get into the brain itself. The book really emphasizes the limbic brain as the key to understanding these honest, unfiltered signals.
Yeah.
Why is that?
So the limbic brain is this ancient part of our brain that operates on a more primitive level. It's responsible for our emotions and survival instincts. It reacts reflexively and instantaneously without conscious thought.
So it's like our gut feeling, that instant reaction we can't always explain.
Exactly. And because the limbic brain bypasses our conscious filtering, its responses are often considered more genuine and unfiltered than our words. We can lie with our words, but our body language often betrays our true feelings.
Makes sense. So the limbic brain is like the source of our honest nonverbal signals.
Right. And from this limbic brain come our primary survival responses: freeze, flight, and fight.
The classic fight or flight response, everyone's heard of that.
Yeah.
But freeze, that's a bit less familiar.
Yeah, so freeze is that deer in the headlights reaction. When you're suddenly confronted with something unexpected or potentially threatening, your first instinct is often to freeze for a split second.
That's like your brain is trying to figure out what to do next.
Exactly. It's a momentary pause that allows the brain to assess the situation and decide on the best course of action, whether to run, hide, or fight.
And the book gives some examples of how this freeze response manifests in everyday life, like when you suddenly remember you forgot to do something important, like turning off the stove.
Yeah, the author describes someone stopping dead in their tracks and touching their forehead as they realize they left the iron on that brief moment of stillness. That's the freeze response in action.
You had a personal story about this too, something about your mom's house and a doorbell.
Oh yeah, this is a great one. So I was at my mom's place late one night and the doorbell rang, which was super rare in their quiet neighborhood, and everyone in the house just froze instantly, like time stood still.
That's so funny.
It was hilarious. And I remember looking around and everyone's hands were just suspended in midair. Whatever they were doing just stopped. It turned out to be my sister who'd forgotten her keys, but that initial instinctive reaction was that shared freeze response to a potential threat.
So it's like our primal instincts kicking in, even when the threat is not real.
Totally. The author even mentions that soldiers in combat often describe this same feeling of paralysis when they encounter sudden danger. So it's a very real and powerful response.
Wow. Okay, so freeze isn't just about completely stopping all movement. It can also manifest as trying to make yourself less noticeable, like hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. The book talks about how this freeze response can sometimes show up as an attempt to shrink or disappear, to blend in with the surroundings, like shoplifters, for example. They often try to make themselves less conspicuous by restricting their movements, hunching over, avoiding eye contact.
Ironically, those behaviors often make them stand out even more.
Right, because they're not acting naturally, they're trying too hard to be invisible, and that makes them look suspicious.
What about this turtle effect the book mentions? Is that another manifestation of the freeze response?
Yeah, the turtle effect is when someone raises their shoulders and lowers their head, like they're trying to withdraw into their shell. It's often seen in people who've experienced a loss of confidence or humiliation, like a sports team walking off the field after a crushing defeat.
Or kids who are being abused, they often exhibit this turtle effect around their abuser.
It's heartbreaking, but it's a way of trying to protect themselves, to make themselves smaller and less of a target.
Okay, so that's freeze. The next survival response is flight. The urge to escape danger, That one seems pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, when freezing isn't an option or doesn't feel safe, our limbic brain triggers the flight response, that powerful desire to get as far away from the threat as possible.
Running is the most obvious manifestation of this response, but there are other subtler ways it can show up too.
Definitely like fidgeting, shifting your weight, leaning away from someone, those can all be signs of the flight response kicking in, even if you're not physically running away.
Interesting. Okay, and then we have the fight response. In today's world, it doesn't always mean a physical altercation. How does it play out non-verbally?
Right, so while the original fight response prepared our bodies for physical confrontation in our modern society, it often manifests in more socially acceptable ways, primarily as verbal aggression.
So things like arguing, insulting, using sarcasm, even filing lawsuits can be seen as modern equivalents of the fight response.
Totally. It's about asserting dominance and control without resorting to physical violence. The book also talks about eye-blocking behaviors as a nonverbal form of fighting.
Eye blocking. What's that?
It's basically anything you do to avoid looking at something unpleasant, like lowering your eyelids, closing your eyes, completely looking away, covering your eyes with your hands.
Like when you see something gross and you just can't look?
Exactly. It's your body's way of trying to shut out a negative stimulus, even if it's just information.
Interesting. So it's not just about physical threats. The fight response can also be triggered by unpleasant thoughts or ideas.
Absolutely. Okay, now here's something important to remember. The limbic brain isn't just about negative experiences and triggering these survival responses. It also plays a key role in positive emotions.
Oh, so it's not all doom and gloom.
No, not at all. The limbic brain acts like this super efficient memory system that records both positive and negative experiences with equal clarity. So it builds up an emotional history that shapes our future reactions and behaviors.
This is why it can be so hard to truly forgive someone who's hurt us. That experience gets logged into the limbic system, and it can trigger those same negative emotions even years later.
Exactly. And on the flip side, when we experience something positive, those good feelings get stored in the limbic system too, and they can influence our future behavior in a positive way.
So it's like our limbic brain is constantly shaping our perceptions and reactions based on our past experiences.
Yep. And the author references Gavin de Becker's book, The Gift of Fear here, which talks about how our gut feelings, those initial limbic responses, can often be valuable warning signals that we shouldn't ignore.
Those visceral reactions that we sometimes dismiss as being irrational might actually be rooted in real experiences stored in our limbic brain.
Exactly. Okay, now let's talk about pacifying behaviors. These are the little things we do to soothe ourselves when we're feeling stressed or uncomfortable.
Like fidgeting or biting our nails.
Yeah, those are common ones. But the book highlights neck touching as a particularly significant pacifying behavior, especially in women.
Why is that?
So women tend to touch or cover the suprasternal notch, that's the little indentation at the base of the neck just above the breastbone. It's a very sensitive area, and touching it can be a way of self-soothing when you're feeling stressed or insecure.
The book says that this seemingly minor gesture can actually be a strong indicator of distress, discomfort, or even deception.
Right, the author tells this story about an investigation where observing this neck-touching behavior was a crucial turning point. It helped him crack the case.
And there's that funny anecdote about Facebook to disgrace book where leg cleansing became a major red flag during a job interview.
Oh man, that one's a classic. So this guy's in a job interview and he's doing great until the conversation turns to social media and the possibility of embarrassing online content. And suddenly the interviewer notices him frantically stroking and cleansing the side of his leg.
Like he's trying to wipe something off.
Exactly. And the interviewer's like, okay, something's up here. So after the interview, he checks out the guy's Facebook profile and wouldn't you know, it's full of unprofessional and embarrassing stuff.
So his leg cleansing was a dead giveaway that he was hiding something.
It was a classic example of how these pacifying behaviors can betray our true feelings, even when we're trying to keep them hidden.
So pay attention to those little self-soothing gestures. They can tell you a lot about what someone is really thinking and feeling. Okay, let's move down the body now to the feet and legs. The book boldly declares these as the most honest part of the body. Why is that?
Well, think about it. For millions of years, our feet and legs were our primary means of locomotion. You know, we relied on them to navigate our environment, escape danger, and survive. So they've been essential for our survival throughout our evolutionary history.
That makes sense.
And because they developed long before our sophisticated verbal language or our ability to consciously control our facial expressions, they often reveal our true sentiments and intentions, even when we're trying to mask them with our words or our facial expressions.
So our feet and legs are like these ancient nonverbal communicators.
Exactly. And the book uses the example of kids to illustrate this. You know how kids will often betray their true desires with their feet, even when they're trying to be good.
Like when they're supposed to be sitting still at the dinner table, but their feet are swinging back and forth.
Totally. Their upper body might be under control, but their feet are already itching to run off and play. It's a clear nonverbal signal of their true desire.
And then there's happy feet, that bouncing, kicking motion. That's a pretty clear sign of positive emotions.
Oh yeah, happy feet are a dead giveaway that someone is feeling good, excited, or content. The author tells the story about being at an airport and overhearing a mom talking on the phone.
Let me guess, her feet started bouncing when her son got on the line.
You got it. She was standing there with her feet planted firmly on the ground. But the second her son's voice came through the phone, her feet just sprung to life, bouncing up and down with this infectious energy.
Oh, that's sweet.
It was a beautiful example of how our feet can express pure joy and excitement, even when we're not consciously aware of it.
But those same foot and leg movements can also signal something completely different, like impatience, right?
That's a great point. Context is key here. So while happy feet indicate positive feelings, similar movements can also just mean that someone is impatient or wants things to move along more quickly.
Like students in a classroom whose legs are bouncing as the end of class approaches.
Exactly. It's like their feet are already out the door.
What about this idea of gravity defiance in the feet, raising the toes while keeping the heel on the ground? What's that all about?
So gravity defiance is when we do something with our feet that seems to defy gravity, even if it's just a little bit. It often happens when we receive good news or experience a surge of positive emotions, like our limbic brain is literally lifting us up.
So like rocking up onto the balls of our feet or walking with a spring in our step.
Exactly. The author describes seeing this guy talking on the phone, and his foot, which was initially flat on the floor, suddenly shifted so that only his heel was touching the ground. His toes were pointing up like he was about to take off.
And I bet he got good news on that call.
He did. A few seconds later, he let out this whoop of joy. It was amazing to see how that subtle shift in his foot posture foreshadowed his positive emotional response.
It's incredible how much we can learn from these tiny nonverbal cues. The book also mentions how people might subtly inch closer to you on their feet when they're really engaged in telling a story.
Yeah, it's like they're unconsciously trying to close the distance between you to share the experience more intimately, even if they're not moving their whole body. Their feet might shift forward just a little bit as they get caught up in the story.
And then there's the more intimate side of leg touching like footsies under the table, which apparently has something to do with the concentration of sensory receptors in our feet.
So here's the interesting thing. Our feet are packed with sensory receptors, and the neural pathways from those receptors actually terminate in an area of the brain that's very close to where genital sensations are registered.
No way.
Yeah. So this neurological proximity probably explains why leg touching and footsies can feel so pleasurable and even be sexually arousing for some.
Wow, I never knew that.
It also explains why we tend to instinctively pull our feet away if someone we dislike accidentally brushes against them. It's like a subconscious rejection signal.
That's fascinating. Okay, so even in the realm of romance and intimacy, the language of the feet could be incredibly revealing. The book also talks about how criminals, these crime shoppers, often exhibit different foot and walking patterns compared to regular people.
Right, so law enforcement officers are trained to look for certain nonverbal cues that might indicate criminal intent. And one of those cues is the way someone walks.
So how do criminals walk differently?
Well, the book describes how criminals, especially those who are casing a potential target, often walk on the inside of the sidewalk. They might change their speed erratically, and they often engage in what looks like aimless window shopping. But they're actually scanning the environment for vulnerabilities or potential victims.
So their movements are less purposeful and more calculated.
Exactly. They're trying to blend in, but their subconscious anxiety often betrays them through their body language.
And Customs and Border Protection officers are also trained to watch the direction of people's feet, right? Like if their feet are pointed towards an exit, even when they're facing the officer, it could be a sign that they're trying to hide something.
Absolutely. It's a subtle cue, but a very telling one. If someone's feet are pointed towards an escape route, even when they're engaging with you, it suggests that they're feeling anxious, uncomfortable, or possibly even deceptive.
So the feet might be planning an escape, even when the face is trying to project calmness.
Exactly. It's a classic example of how our nonverbal communication can contradict our words.
Okay, what about the reaction of withdrawing your feet under a chair when you're asked a stressful question?
Ah, that's a great one. That's often an unconscious distancing reaction. When someone feels uncomfortable or threatened, they might instinctively pull their feet and legs back underneath their chair as if trying to create a physical barrier.
Like they're trying to make themselves smaller and less exposed?
Exactly. It's a subtle but powerful sign of discomfort, and you'll often see people's feet reappear as the conversation moves to safer territory.
So the feet are like these little emotional barometers.
Totally. They can give you a real-time read on someone's comfort level. Okay, last one for this section. The book mentions how our torsos can also subtly blade away from things we dislike or find unpleasant.
Blading away, what does that mean?
So blading away is when you turn your torso slightly away from something, even if you're still facing it head on. It's a way of creating distance without being too obvious.
Like when you see something gross on the street, you kind of turn away, but you're still looking at it out of the corner of your eye?
Exactly. Or the book uses the example of visitors at the Holocaust Museum. Some people would approach the exhibits directly and engage fully, but others would kind of blade away as the full impact of what they were seeing started to sink in.
Like their bodies were instinctively recoiling from the emotional impact.
Right. And this blading away can happen even when you're just talking about something unpleasant or listening to someone say something you disagree with.
It's a subtle way of showing disapproval or discomfort.
Exactly. Okay, so we've covered the feet and legs. Let's move up to the torso. Now, how does the limbic brain orchestrate the torso's response in those fight or flight scenarios?
Well, I know our breathing changes. We start taking short, shallow breaths.
That's right. When the limbic brain senses danger, it kicks off a cascade of physiological changes, including increased heart rate, rapid breathing, and the redirection of blood flow away from the skin and towards the large muscle groups in the arms and legs.
So our body is literally preparing us to either fight or flee.
Yep. And this redistribution of blood flow can sometimes cause someone to appear pale or even feel physically cold, even if the room temperature is normal.
The book mentions this example of a young guy who was being interviewed, and he kept complaining about being cold even though the AC was off.
Yeah, he was clutching a pillow tightly, and despite the comfortable room temperature, he just couldn't get warm. It was a clear sign of his extreme anxiety and stress. His body was in full fight or flight mode.
And stress can also wreak havoc on our digestive system, right?
Totally. When the limbic brain perceives a threat, it prioritizes immediate survival functions over things like digestion, so you might lose your appetite, feel nauseous, or even vomit in extreme situations.
It's like your body is saying, we don't have time to digest food right now. We need all our energy to deal with this threat.
Exactly. It's amazing how our body can adapt so quickly to perceive danger. Now, on a lighter note, let's talk about the torso bow. This is a gesture that can be both a conscious sign of respect and a more subtle, subconscious expression of regard.
Like a slight inclination of the head.
Right. In many Western cultures, a deep formal bow is less common. But even a small inclination of the torso can convey respect or deference. It can be conscious gesture, like when you bow your head slightly as a greeting, or it can happen unconsciously as a natural response to someone you admire or respect.
The book mentions how in some Eastern European cultures, they click their heels and offer a small bow as a greeting.
It's a charming example of a culturally ingrained gesture of respect, and it shows how even small movements can carry significant social coding. Okay, now let's shift gears and talk about something we have more conscious control over: our clothing and overall appearance.
This is a fascinating area because our clothing and appearance send these incredibly powerful nonverbal messages to everyone around us.
Totally. And the book uses this great dark street scenario to illustrate the point. Imagine you're walking alone down a dark street at night and you hear footsteps approaching from behind. How would you feel if the silhouette you saw was someone in a business suit carrying a briefcase versus someone in baggy, disheveled clothing?
I definitely feel more threatened by the second scenario, even though I haven't actually seen their face or anything.
Exactly. Our limbic brain makes these instant threat assessments based on very limited information, and clothing is a huge part of that assessment.
So we're constantly making these snap judgments about people based on their appearance, whether we realize it or not.
And the book encourages us to be more mindful of the messages we're sending with our clothing and grooming, because those messages are being received and interpreted by everyone we interact with.
It's like we're all walking billboards projecting our personal brand through our appearance.
Exactly. And it's not just about the clothes themselves, it's also about our grooming and what the book calls preening behaviors.
Preening, like adjusting our hair or clothes.
Yeah, those little things we do to maintain our appearance, they can signal a lot about our overall well-being.
Oh, so.
Well, when we're feeling good physically and mentally, we tend to take more care of our appearance. We make sure we look presentable. But when we're struggling with illness fatigue or depression, our grooming often suffers.
That makes sense. You're not really focused on how you look when you're not feeling well.
Right. The author gives the example of people experiencing homelessness or severe mental illness. Their appearance often reflects their internal struggles.
So paying attention to someone's grooming habits can be a way to gauge their overall well-being.
Absolutely. It's another piece of the nonverbal puzzle. Okay, let's move up to the chest and shoulders. Now, the book talks about puffing up the chest as a classic territorial display.
Like when someone's trying to intimidate you.
Yeah, it's a way of making yourself look bigger and more powerful. It's a very primal instinct that we share with many animals in the animal kingdom. Think about a silverback gorilla beating its chest, or a dog puffing up its fur.
So when you see someone puffing up their chest, it's a sign that they're feeling threatened or aggressive.
Exactly. It's a nonverbal way of saying, back off, or don't mess with me. The book mentions how people often puff out their chests right before a physical altercation.
Like those classic schoolyard fights where the kids puff up their chests and try to look tough.
Totally. And there's this great anecdote in the book about two neighbors who got into a fight over a sprinkler. And as the argument escalated, one of the guys started unbuttoning his shirt.
Oh no, that's never a good sign.
Right. The author who witnessed this recognized it immediately as a precursor to violence. He knew that things were about to get physical, and sure enough, the shirt came off and the chest bumping and shoving began.
So unbuttoning a shirt in the context of an argument is a pretty clear nonverbal signal that someone's ready to fight.
It's a classic example of how our body language can escalate a conflict. Okay, now let's talk about shoulder shrugs. There's a difference between a full equal shrug and a partial or one-sided shrug.
Yeah, I've noticed that. What's the significance of that?
So a full symmetrical shrug where both shoulders rise equally towards the ears usually means genuine uncertainty or a lack of knowledge. It's like a sincere, I don't know.
It's like you're genuinely clueless.
Exactly, but a partial shrug where only one shoulder rises or the movement is uneven suggests a lack of commitment or even potential deception. It means the person isn't fully invested in or truthful about what they're saying.
So it's like a half-hearted shrug.
Right, like they're not really buying into what they're saying or they're trying to hedge their bets.
So a less enthusiastic shoulder shrug can be a red flag that someone's not being completely honest.
Exactly. Okay, what about restrained arm movements? What might that indicate?
Well, I know that when I'm feeling nervous or uncomfortable, I tend to hold my arms close to my body.
That's a very common response to stress or anxiety. The author talks about how he used to work at a bookstore, and he noticed that shoplifters often used fewer arm movements than regular shoppers.
Interesting. So they were trying to make themselves smaller and less noticeable.
Right, they were subconsciously trying to avoid attracting attention. But ironically, this lack of natural arm movement actually made them stand out more to the trained observer.
So trying to hide can sometimes make you more visible.
It's counterintuitive, but it's true. Okay, now let's talk about the language of the arms themselves. Open, outstretched arms are generally seen as a sign of warmth and welcome. But there are some nuances to that gesture.
What do you mean?
So fully open, outstretched arms are definitely a universal sign of welcome, like an embrace. But when the arms are extended less fully, maybe only bent at the elbows with the upper arms held close to the body, it can indicate a more reserved welcome or even some hesitation.
Like you're not fully embracing the person?
Exactly. The author gives this example of his own daughter, who used to do this with a relative she wasn't particularly fond of. When she greeted him, her arms would only extend halfway. It was like she was saying, I'm acknowledging you, but I'm not thrilled to see you.
That's hilarious. Kids are so honest with their body language.
They are, and it's a good reminder for us to pay attention to those subtle variations in arm gestures because they can reveal a lot about how someone truly feels okay, and arms can communicate a whole range of messages from a simple wave, hello or goodbye, to more definitive signals like stop or don't come close.
Like when you put your arms behind your back?
Yeah, that's often misinterpreted as a sign of thoughtfulness or contemplation, but unless it's in a very specific context, like someone studying a piece of art, it usually means keep your distance.
It's like you're creating a physical barrier.
Exactly. And the book mentions that even our pets are sensitive to these kinds of segregating arm gestures. They can pick up on our nonverbal cues and react accordingly.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Okay, what about the posture of arms akimbo? Hands on the hips, elbows pointing outwards. That always seems like a very assertive stance.
It is, arms akimbo is a classic power pose. It's a way of taking up more space and asserting dominance. It can also be a sign of frustration or anger, like you're ready to confront
And
someone.
what about the hooding effect? That's when someone leans back in a chair with their hands clasped behind their head and their elbows flared out.
Ah, yes, the hooding effect. That's another classic power move. It's often seen in business meetings or negotiations, and it conveys a sense of confidence and control.
Like a king on his throne.
Totally. And the author compares it to a cobra hooding to make itself look bigger and more threatening. It's a way of non-verbally saying, I'm in charge here.
Okay, what about the gesture of splaying your arms wide apart, like when someone leans on a counter with their arms extended?
Splayed arms are another way of claiming territory. It's like you're spreading out your wings and saying, this is my space.
The book gives that funny example of the airline passenger arguing with the gate agent about an overweight luggage fee.
Yeah, he was so indignant that he splayed his arms out on the counter and had to bend over at the waist just to maintain the posture. It was a hilarious visual representation of his frustration and his attempt to dominate the situation.
Okay, and the way we position our arms when we're seated next to someone can be a subtle but important cue, especially in the context of dating or attraction,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. When people are sitting close together, the positioning of their arms can reveal a lot about their level of comfort and intimacy. Casual arm touching, for example, can generate a sense of connection and even physical pleasure because our arms are so sensitive to touch.
So if you're on a date and you're trying to gauge the other person's interest, pay attention to their arms.
Definitely, if they're constantly pulling their arms away, it might be a sign that they're not feeling it, but if they're comfortable letting their arms brush against yours, it could be a good sign. And our arms can also be adorned with various items like jewelry, watches, tattoos, which can send nonverbal messages about our wealth status and
It's
beliefs.
like our arms are these mini billboards projecting our personal brand.
Totally. And the book talks about how even something as seemingly insignificant as a watch can send a strong signal about your socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
A Rolex versus a Timex. It's
Yeah.
a subtle but powerful way of communicating your place in the world.
And tattoos can be tricky. They're becoming more mainstream, but they can still be perceived negatively in certain contexts.
Absolutely. The author mentions research that suggests that jurors might view tattoos unfavorably. So if you're in a situation where you're trying to make a good impression, it might be wise to cover up your tattoos.
Makes sense. Okay, and then there's the abrazo, that brief hug that's common in many cultures. It's not always just a simple greeting, is it?
Nope. The abrazo can be used strategically, especially in high-stakes situations like law enforcement or intelligence work.
What does it mean?
Well, the author tells this story about an espionage trial where he hugged the defendant as a way to discreetly check if he was armed.
Whoa, that's sneaky.
It was a quick and subtle way to gather information without raising suspicion, so the abrazo can be a form of nonverbal intelligence gathering.
That's fascinating. What about a brief casual touch on the arm during a conversation? What's the message there?
A touch on the arm can be a way of communicating empathy, connection, and reassurance. It's like saying, we're okay, or I understand.
It's a very common gesture in many cultures.
Especially in Mediterranean, South American, and Arab cultures, where physical touch is a more integrated part of social interaction in those cultures. The absence of such touch might even be interpreted as a sign of distance or disapproval.
So it's important to be aware of those cultural differences and to use touch appropriately.
Absolutely. Okay. Let's talk about hands. Now, handshakes are obviously a big one. They're often the first physical contact we have with someone, and they can make a huge impression.
A firm handshake is always a good sign.
Definitely, it conveys confidence and strength, but a limp handshake can be perceived as weakness or lack of interest. And then you've got all those offensive hand gestures that you definitely want to avoid, like finger pointing, the middle finger, snapping your fingers at someone.
Right, those are universally disliked,
Yeah.
and they can really damage your credibility.
For sure. The author recommends 2 great books for learning more about hand gestures: Body Talk, The Meaning of Human Gestures by Desmond Morris, and Gestures, The Do's and Taboos of Body Language Around the World by Roger E. Axtell. They're full of fascinating insights into the cultural nuances of hand gestures.
Okay, so we've covered